This video will show you the basics of scaling in your slicer. So the first thing you do is you open up your slicing software. Now for this I'm using Cura, but you can use any slicing software. They're pretty much all the same. So the first thing you're going to do is import the model that you want to scale, and for this example I'm going to use the Caribbean Shack. Just drag the model in, and it takes a little while to process, and automatically it starts calculating the slicing time. Once your model is selected, you can scale using this tool here. Normally when you're scaling an object, you lock the uniform scaling. This means that everything scales the same, keeping it all in proportion. To scale uniformly, you can do one of two things. You can scale by a factor, which for example 0.5 is 50%, 2 is 200%, or twice as big. Or you can scale, give it the measurements here. So for example, if I want this to be 50 high, simply delete that, and then I just put 50 in there. So that's made this object 50 high, and what it's done, it's told me it's scaled it up by 1.13. So if I remember that number, all the rest of the parts of that model I can just scale up by 1.13 and they'll be compatible. So the roof I scale up by 1.133, the base I scale up by 1.133. So that's the basics of scaling models. Now if you want to scale models and see how they look when they're connected together, you can bring them into the slicer to compare them. For example, we have SID scale, and you can bring SID scale into the model to have a look and see how he's going to sit in relation to that model. So I'm going to bring in the SID scale 25mm, and that's SID scale with a 25mm base. And you can check out SID, and you can look at his size. He's 35mm high and his base is 25mm. So you could, if you wanted to, scale SID to match whatever figures you're using. So if all of your warlord figures are only 30mm high with a 25mm base, take off uniform scaling on SID scale and scale him down to 30 high. Now there is SID at 30mm high with a 25mm base. Now what you can do is you can move SID, and you can see there that with this scaling, SID's the 25mm bases are going to impact on the side. So if I was scaling this purely for use with 25mm and I wanted the models to sit in there, then I would scale this up a little bit. So with uniform scaling locked, I'm going to make it 1.4 and see if that's big enough. And there I can see SID easily sits inside the model. And you can do that with everything. For example, if you want the chicken legs for a walk-in building to fit something else, you can bring the building in and see how they sit. So that's how you check the scale and adjust the scale of different objects. If I was playing Flames of War, then I would bring in my Flames of War base, and then I would scale that down accordingly for Flames of War. So I would scale it. You can actually just, if uniform scaling locked, you can just scale it down like this by grabbing one of the sliders with uniform scaling locked, and you can just let that, see how that's going to look, see if they're going to fit in there. So Flames of War, that's how you could fit the base in there, which is great. But as you know, as you look at this, you can see it's way too big for Flames of War, because this is a small hut designed for 1 or 2 men to go inside. So what you might do in this case is scale it even further just by eye to see what kind of looks good. And then you might say, great, that's looking good for my Flames of War guys. And then it's this little tiny hut that you've scaled by 50% for Flames of War. We would normally say 60% scaling, but you can see 60% might be too big. And then before you print, of course, delete SID scale. Now SID scale comes in a wide variety of things, so you can see how things are going to look. relative to your models for the game that you're playing before you print. Thanks for watching.